Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Alberta sunny afternoon webinar, a lunch and learn brought to you by the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. My name is Michael Jans. I'm the Partnership Engagement Manager, and with me here is Corey Dodge. We are here to help you expand and enhance your mentoring programs. One of our goals is to help build research capacity in mentoring throughout the Alberta mentoring movement, and we have with us a very special guest today, Michael Geringer, who's the Director of Knowledge Management for Mentor, which is the national mentoring partnership in the United States. And Michael does a tremendous amount of research, not just in the US, but with partners around the world on how to build better mentoring programs, how to ensure that we can take mentoring research and bridge it into practice, how we can connect other kinds of research that affect youth and youth development and make sure that we can apply it to our mentoring programs. So I always learn a ton whenever I have a chance to listen to Michael, and we're very honored that he's helped us out here today by sharing his wisdom with the Alberta crowd. So before we get started, we're going to have for the format for today, we're going to have a presentation from Michael, and then there's going to be a chance for you to interact with us, to ask some questions and to give your feedback. Corey, can you tell the audience how they can ask questions?
If you have any questions during the webinar, just throw them out into the questions box there in the right-hand side of your screens, or you can throw them in the chat box as well. We'll collect them throughout, so just feel free to ask your questions whenever you think of them, and then we'll get to them within the last 10 minutes of the webinar.
So just to test, Corey's going to ask you in the chat box if it's sunny where you are this afternoon, and you can just say hello and give them a weather update. And then we're also going to just some baseline data for our webinar. We want to survey you on 2 questions. And so first we're going to ask you, how many of you have heard of the Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring? This is a publication from Mentor, our partners in the United States, that they put out. And it just wanted to see what our baseline is, if any of you have had a chance to read it or to review it. So Corey, do you want to show them the question?
Yep, the question's up right now, and we have about 67% who voted. So that should be good.
So what's the outcome there? Okay, yeah, about half of you have heard of it, half of you haven't. So that's great. We're going to make sure to send you a link to it in the show notes after the webinar today. And we've got one other question for you. We're just curious, how many of you implement some form of evaluation or evaluative practice in your mentoring program currently? So we'll look at the results here. Oh wow, 90% of you already said yes, 10% no. No worries, we've got some resources for you. So and I think that's perfect timing that Michael's sharing with us today about how we can even level up our evaluations and make them just a little bit better. So as part of our AMP goal of expanding and enhancing mentoring and strengthening Alberta's mentoring network, we have a couple more webinars coming up in the next few weeks that we want to alert you to. The next one is on May 1st. We have a special webinar with it's on the topic of Indigenous peer mentoring. We're going to have Dr. Kate Story and Dr. Noreen Willows, who are researchers with the University of Alberta, who are going to be sharing their findings from doing peer mentoring research here in Alberta. I believe it's applicable to both on and off reserve. So I strongly encourage you to learn about this program if you do work with Indigenous kids, self-identified or not, if you do school, after-school programs, community-based programs. I think there's something here for you. So do check it out. It's going to be a lunch and learn on Tuesday, May 1st from 12 to 1. Do take a look at that. We're also going to have, for those of you who want to step up your evaluation game, on June 13th, we're going to have another webinar called Evaluation One-on-One. There's a group in Edmonton called the Evaluation Capacity Network, and we've got some of our partners at the Community University Partnership at the U of A who are involved in this. They've been kind enough to put together this webinar for us in terms of evaluation. So it's valuable to board members, staff members, anybody in your organization who is in program design, thinking about how do we do what we do better, how do we know we're being successful, and how to ask the right questions and make sure you're measuring your success accordingly for funders and others. So it's going to be Bethan Kingsley, who's going to share with us. So Bethan is a postdoc with the Community University Partnership. So I strongly encourage you to tune into this one as well too. That'll be June 13th. And of course, bring a friend or invite a colleague who might be interested, even if they're not directly in peer mentoring or mentoring programs rather. And then finally, we're very excited to say that our first AMP Learning Day, our in-person mini symposium, all about research evaluation and knowledge mobilization in the field of mentoring, is now full, and we have a wait list going. So if you are hearing about this event for the first time and you want to come to a one-day in-person Edmonton event where we're going to be sharing research and evaluation training and knowledge mobilization in terms of research for mentoring programs here in Edmonton, it's going to be May 25th. If you want to get on the wait list for that, please send us an email, mentor.support@albertamentors.ca. We're hoping to do more of these events in future, so your support helps us gauge interest, agenda, etc., and next steps. So please do be in touch with us if that's something that you think would help you. So I'm just going to look to Corey. I think I've cleared through our housekeeping. And now we're going to invite Michael Geringer, the Director of Knowledge Management for Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, to take the stage. We're excited to hear from Michael because he works with youth mentoring programs, helping them continuously improve their services, improve the outcomes that they produce, and help make sure that the programs are evidence-based, that they're thriving, and that they have the best data to make the case for investment about why mentoring is a very important treatment that we can provide for all of our children and youth. So Michael's going to talk to us today about why and how research can improve a program's outcomes, strategies for measuring the right things in any program, applying research in mentoring and other disciplines research to your own program, and sources of translational research. So whether you're a big mentoring program with hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, or you're a small community-based program that's just started up in the last year, I think you'll really enjoy this presentation and get a lot from what Michael has to say in his further resources. So Michael, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Michael, for that. And, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real treat to be with you. I'm a big fan of the work that Michael and his team does there at the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. And, in my mind, you guys are doing some of the best work in this field in terms of translating research into practice. So it's a real honor to be with you today. And hopefully I can tee up and make people even more curious and want to learn more during that learning day that you've got coming up. It sounds like a great event. I want to talk about a couple of things here. Just quickly, for those of you who don't know Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, we do a lot of things to kind of lead the mentoring movement here in the States, public awareness work, advocacy, and working with the political infrastructure to get more public support for mentoring, a lot of private sector engagement. But what I mostly work on are things that are related to making mentoring programs stronger and growing their ability to serve more kids and serve them better. And so to that end, I kind of lead what is our research agenda, and you can kind of see the four big buckets that we work in here. A lot of effort to make the case that mentoring has value, not only to individual youth, but in addressing social problems to the degree that it can. But really my bread and butter is helping folks just like you find and apply research to their work. And sometimes that involves, drawing from other fields and other disciplines, and we'll talk about a few examples of that today. But really what I like doing is disseminating tools and practices and guidance to programs. I like to think of myself as the reference librarian for the mentoring field. So that's the role that I tend to play in our work. I think Michael just covered kind of what we're going to go through today. I'm hoping we can get through all of this in the hour we've got. I'd like to leave about 10 minutes at the end to hear your questions as well. So I may flow through some of this pretty fast today, but we'll make these slides available after the fact. I've also got a couple of handouts that I can share with you around this last bullet here around sources of translational research and some ways that you as practitioners can, kind of find a new research and then think about what to do with it, if anything. So hopefully we'll have time for that as well. So I want to start off very big picture, just thinking about why research matters in mentoring work. And I've had practitioners kind of push back on the research over the years in conversations with me where they'll say things like, well, that's great that that study found X, Y, and Z, but here in my city, we've got these different needs and you know, we're just doing our own thing and we know it works, which may or may not be true. But I think it also misses the point that this work can always be done better. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know when research is applied to mentoring programs work. I think, you know, we often ask ourselves, are we making a difference? And, you know, it can sometimes feel like we're howling at the moon and it's hard to see the impact of all of these individual relationships add up to community or province level changes, if you will, let alone national changes that are a result of mentoring. But, you know, when we think about what we do in programs, the graphic here on the right, you know, we really are trying to take a group of young people and move them in a direction, right? And that looks different in every program depending on what you're emphasizing, but we really try and move, you know, the young people that are mentored towards an outcome that we'd like to see. And ideally, we would be able to detect, as is shown in the graphic here, that those who didn't have the help of a mentor kind of remain stuck where they're at. And that is the value that we hope to provide to individual lives. But there's a real science to doing that. There's art, but there's also science to it. And, you know, an example of this can be found in the world of psychotherapy. And there was a good meta-analysis done back in the early 2000s by Weiss and colleagues, where they looked at what therapists do when they're meeting with clients. And the outcome of that was that those therapists that were using evidence-based practices, things that have been studied and researched and proven to be impactful for clients, these are often thought of in terms of what's called effect size. And you know, something about 0.5 here is a pretty good meaty effect size. That's, you know, that means you're really moving the needle for people. But you could see the usual care group here on the right. These were therapists that were kind of winging it, just doing what felt right to do for clients instead of what the science perhaps said would be an effective strategy. And you can see their effect size was negligible. That basically means that people were no better off after having gone through those services than they were when they walked in the door. Now, you may be wondering, you know, how does mentoring compare to that in terms of effect size? Well, the David Dubois meta-analysis, and this has been confirmed by several meta-analyses over the years, including an unpublished one that Gene Rhodes is going to be coming out with later this year. We keep coming up with an effect size of about 0.2. Sometimes it's 0.19, sometimes it's the number you see here on the screen, but this is what's considered to be kind of a small or medium-ish effect. And you know, so we've got some work to do, I think, in making mentoring be an impactful experience for young people. That same meta-analysis of programs kind of looked at, you know, what buckets do programs fall into? And you'll see here that most programs have kind of that small to medium effect. There were only a couple that were, you know, proven to be having a large influence over the direction of young people's lives or whatever outcomes they were seeking. There were even a handful that had negative effects. Young people were worse off than when they walked in the door of that program. And that's certainly a circumstance we want to avoid. But I kind of show this to illustrate that, you know, most mentoring programs work just a little bit, but there are some secrets that I think unlock the potential of mentoring programs. Another way of thinking about this, you know, we do some work for the government here in the US on a framework called Crime Solutions, which is the Department of Justice's attempt to look at what works in preventing crime or preventing other negative outcomes for young people and adults. And if you look at the mentoring programs that are in that database, we have 8 that are rated as effective. The bulk of them, though, are either in the promising category, which meant it achieved some of its outcomes, but not all. And then a pretty large chunk where there was no difference between the young people who got mentored and the young people who did not have a mentor in their lives. So, you know, once again, we've got some work to do around this. But here's that good news. And this is from that Dubois meta-analysis where he found that as programs implemented what you might think of as theoretical practices. That's the teal colored line here. And that would be things like, oh, let's do a support group for our mentors so that they can meet once a month and talk about how it's going and share tips with each other. That's a great strategy. I might do that myself if I ran a program, but that hasn't really been tested in research studies as being effective. It seems like a good idea. And you can see as programs did more of those theoretical practices, hey, it looked better, right? They kind of went from not having an effect at all to, if they were doing, a dozen of those, hey, we're up to 0.3. That's pretty good. But the programs that were using evidence-based practices, and I think that Elements of Effective Practice guide is probably your best starting point for what those practices are. You only needed to do about 6 of those to raise your impact on young people up to almost a 0.5, right? So this really illustrates that those practices do matter, and that when research speaks to us about things that you can do in your work that improve outcomes for kids, we should really listen, because I think it's, this is the prime way to improve your program and what kids get out of it. Michael asked, how many folks are familiar with this guide? About half of you were. Just so you know how we've developed these over time, we basically do a huge literature search and also work with a committee of practitioners to make sure that we're hearing their voices in this. So the research can tell you a lot. I also think you learn a lot by just listening to people who do this work every day. And so what you will find in here, we like to call it research informed, not research based, because certainly there are other things that nobody wants to test in a research study, like should we do background checks on our volunteers? Nobody's going to randomly assign some kids to be matched with adults that were unchecked, right? That study will never exist, hopefully. So, it's a combination of practitioner wisdom and what the research says. And we really have tried to build on some of the implementation science, borrowing the ideas of kind of clinical practice guidelines from the medical profession. So if you haven't read it, please download it off our site, give it a good read, and really check and see how many of these things do you do in your work. I will also let you know that there are some supplements to this coming, because I feel like as much as intentionality as we put into this is a diverse field. Many of you are working with very specific groups of young people in different contexts. And so we have some supplements coming out that give additional advice that's grounded in research evidence. And so we have one coming up on STEM mentoring. So if you're doing that to get young people interested in science and engineering, math careers, some additional tips around that. I'm working with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America on one around mentoring LGBTQ youth. And then we've also just got word that we're going to be starting one around workforce focused mentoring. There'll be some overlap with that STEM guide on that one, but also I can tell you in 2019, we're probably going to do e-mentoring. So using electronic communication in mentoring as well as group mentoring. We found in a study here in the States that there were as many kids being served in group mentoring programs as there were one-to-one programs in the US. And so, group programs operate, I think, under some different mechanisms and changes. So I think having a document that speaks to their needs will also be important. Now, we have research that validates the elements of effective practice. Janice Coopersmith and her colleagues found that following those practices, particularly the training standard, really was predictive of preventing premature match closures and strengthening kind of long-term relationships, so multi-year relationships with young people. Tom Keller has done some work here in the States as well, showing that programs that followed more of those practices had better relationships between staff and mentors. And those mentors felt more satisfied with the program, felt stronger in their role. And those organizations also had stronger learning cultures. They just simply wanted to learn more about the work of running a program and kind of had an intellectual curiosity about it that programs that were not following it did not. And I think this is important, applying research to our work, because, mentors and programs face a lot when they go into these relationships with young people. It's not easy. We did a survey of American adults about their mentoring experiences. And this isn't released yet, so you were some of the first people on the face of the earth to see these numbers. We hope to have this report out in June, but you can see the mentors reported, some pretty serious needs around kind of what the family and the mentee they were working with was wrestling with, scheduling conflicts, challenges with the program itself. 27% of mentors rated the quality of support they got from the program staff as poor. And that really has big implications for what happens. We did some regression analysis, which basically is, did the ways that some people answered questions in our survey predict how they answered other questions? And we asked, how likely are you to recommend mentoring in a formal program to others? So if you think about mentors as a recruitment vehicle for other mentors, I think the best way to get more mentors is asking your friends and family, hey, join this cool program that I'm in. It's really rewarding, right? Well, a lot of what predicted whether people would do that on behalf of your program was the quality of support that they received from the program. 43% of their response to yes, I will do this for you was predicted by that. And we also asked, will you stick with mentoring? Are you going to keep mentoring? It didn't predict that, right? So they will stick with a match even if they're unhappy with your staff and the support they're getting from the program. They won't abandon the young person, which is good, right? But they certainly aren't going to bring anyone else to your program doors. So I think this is the type of research that I encourage all of you to kind of pay attention to as it comes out in our field, because this is the biggest mistake I think I see programs making, is they make the match and check in a little bit at the beginning, but then assume that it's going to work out fine. And what we know from the research is that, these relationships will have their challenges and ups and downs. And if your mentors feel, somewhat abandoned or unhappy with the help they're getting in that, they're not going to help grow your program over time. We've also done some interesting research at Mentor, kind of looking at what happens in programs and kind of characteristics of programs. I won't summarize all of it. There's a big study on our website that you can download and look at if you want to at least see how programs look in the US. But we did find some more interesting correlations between programs that were, doing more training of mentors, kind of cost more money per kid served. The more they require of mentors in terms of meeting frequency, those programs also cost a bit more per young person served. That was also true of the level of match support and the expected length of those mentoring relationships. So we were a little worried that maybe all we'd found was that more work cost more money, which that kind of makes sense. But we did some analysis. We asked programs what percentage of your matches last the intended duration of your program. So if you have a 1-year minimum, 6-month minimum, whatever it may be, what percentage of your matches last year made it that far? And you'll notice this interesting trend is that the programs that really get those matches to the finish line and are making strong relationships, they cost more money. This is not work that can be done on the cheap. And so we're even producing research that I think helps you make the case to funders, hey, to do this work well and to really get the results we want out of it, let's not skimp on the money. Let's really invest in what is needed. Unfortunately, we also found in this study that the average cost per child served adjusted for inflation had not changed in almost 20 years, going back to an old study from the late 90s. And so that was a little disappointing, because I think mentors are asked to do a heck of a lot more today and wrestle with problems that are much more challenging than they were 20 years ago. So paying attention to the research can also help you make the case around funding and other aspects of your work. There's also this, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit as we go through the rest of the presentation. Mentors seem to be more effective when the programs that they work in are aligned with evidence-based practices, and when mentors are trained to use evidence-based intervention strategies in their work. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that coming up in a minute, but there's been a real shift in our field away from, you see the quote here, I took this from Gene Rhodes' Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring website. She had a post about this topic a while back. And for a long time, we've operated under what might be called the friendship model. But I'm seeing a shift in our field towards asking mentors to not only do that friendship piece, but also borrow from other disciplines and kind of use evidence-based practices coming from other fields, from psychotherapy, from education, from other human development fields. So this trend is important, and I don't think you're going to be able to participate in it as a program if you're not paying attention to research. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the best possible evidence you will ever have, which is your own, the evidence that you generate from your own program. Now, I was encouraged to see that 90% of you are doing some kind of evaluation of your program. We didn't ask kind of what that looked like, but we did a poll here in the US a while back asking what percentage of programs did evaluation, and got similarly high numbers, although you guys are a little bit higher than programs in the States. But when we ask folks, does your evaluation involve some kind of counterfactual, a comparison group of non-mentored kids, a control group of some kind, some way of showing that it's your program that might be moving the needle and not other things, that number dropped down to 8% of programs. So we'll talk about why that's important here in a minute. But I think it's important to remember, we always get hung up on these big studies of mentoring, these random control trials, and kind of these real science-y things. But I think it's important to remember that the term evidence-based, if you go back to its origins in the medical profession, research was only part of that equation, right? And this graphic kind of shows what I think an optimal evidence-based practice would really look like, right? That would involve the input of you all as practitioners that do this work every day. It would involve the community. What are the values of the community? It would involve policymakers and funders. And I think most importantly, the service users. What do the people that are in your program think of it, and what would they like to see strengthened and improved? So while I'm going to be pushing you guys today to really consume kind of the more rigorous research, I don't ever want folks to feel like that's all that matters. I think we have a trend here in the US where we make a lot of policy decisions based only on the hard evidence. And I think that leads to some bad decisions very quickly. So I just wanted to kind of give this as a frame of reference. So what would I measure if I ran a mentoring program? I think I would focus on these three things: the implementation of my services. And frankly, when I read evaluations of programs where there was no impact and the mentored kids didn't look any different, that this is usually the reason: poor implementation. I also think the quality of the relationship is the linchpin of all of this. And then I also see programs sometimes measuring things that I think are a little too far out for what makes sense. And we'll unpack these a little bit here. So implementation of services, right? Are you doing the things in reality that you say you do on paper? And I've got some examples up here on the slide, but you'd be shocked how many times I read an evaluation of an ineffective program and half of their mentors didn't go through the training fully, or they recruited people that were a poor fit for it, or they didn't offer the match support that was needed to kind of keep those relationships going through the ups and downs. 9 times out of 10, this is what sinks a mentoring program. So I really encourage folks to evaluate this before you start looking at the impact you have on young people. So when you're looking about implementation, and you could apply this to just about anything that you do in your program, there's kind of 3 ways you could think about it. One is the consistency. Are we doing what we say we're going to do? The training example I just gave, where half of your mentors didn't go through the training, right? That's not consistent. Conversely, if you change things up, you might uncover that an adaptation that you made was useful, that it was better than the old way that you were doing it. You could also measure participation, right? So if we offer 6 ongoing trainings for our mentors, did they participate in those? Did they only show up to 1 or 2? and even including things like when they're meeting with their young person, if you're using a curriculum that guides their activities, are they sticking to it, or are they kind of, going off and doing their own thing? And then the quality of it, how well are you delivering it? You may offer that training to 100% of your mentors, but if it's a low quality training, who cares, right? It's not going to change anything or make them more efficacious. So that's 3 different ways to think about measuring implementation. Relationship quality, the graphic here on the slide is Jean Rhodes' model of her theoretical model of how mentoring works and produces outcomes. And you'll see in kind of the diamond shape there, diamond A, mutuality, trust, empathy. Basically, this relationship has to have some characteristics and some real integrity to it in order for it to produce outcomes for young people. It's got to be a real relationship, right? They actually have to have some closeness, but you'd be surprised how many times I see programs not think about measuring this. Now, we're working on some updates to a tool that we offer called the Measurement Guidance Toolkit. We hope to have these updates up in June that will be measures of relationship quality. And that ranges from everything from, does the mentor listen to me? Does my mentor give me a voice in what we do in our match? All the way up to random things like, the mentor's relationship with the parent, or the mentor's level of kind of cultural responsiveness and respect. There are many factors that go into making a good relationship, and hopefully those tools, when we put them out in June, will help you guys measure that in your relationships. And you can see here, what constitutes, these are things that you could measure about the relationships in your program. Are they youth-centered? Are they close? Do the mentor trust the mentee and vice versa? Are your mentors providing instrumental support? So it's one thing to be a friend. It's another thing to be able to offer like actual tangible help with filling out a college application, or making sure you get transportation to your, health appointment or something. So there's a lot of different things you can measure about relationships. And as I mentioned, the toolkit, we hope to have that up in June. You'll see the link here at the bottom, National Mentoring Resource Center.org. I know that's a terrible URL. We tried to get them to approve nmrc.org, but they wouldn't have it. So that is the URL. We'll be talking about some other resources that you can find on that site that I think will be helpful to you. And then measuring outcomes. I think most of what you will find in that measurement guidance toolkit are what's up there currently are things around outcomes for young people. And you can see the kind of 6 or 7 broad buckets that we've sorted those into. Within each of these, you'll find 5 or 6 different things to measure in there. And we tried to pick ones that we felt were reflective of what mentoring programs have proven to achieve, right? And that can be anything from connectedness to school, to emotional self-regulation, to effective peer relationships. Whatever it is that you think your program does for young people, you can find tools in here that will allow you to measure that in kind of a pre-post way. And for everything we've recommended in here, you can get your hands right on it. You can download it and start using it in your work. So I encourage everyone to do that. And if you're using a homegrown tool that you made yourself, you may want to not do that. One of the things that we included in here, we only selected instruments that have been proven to be valid and reliable in other research, meaning that they actually accurately measure the thing they say they're measuring, and that has been repeated in many studies over time. So that, yes, when this says I'm improving in my connectedness to school, we can trust that that actually is happening for the young person. So just some general tips on how to measure outcomes. I think one mistake I see programs make is kind of the kitchen sink approach. Let's ask mentees about every single aspect of their life and assume that our program might have an impact on all of them. Sometimes that makes it look like your program's ineffective. If you ask about 20 outcomes and find that you only moved the needle on 2 of them, it looks like you failed on 18, even though if you'd only looked for the 2 that you're working on, it'd look like you're batting, 1,000 on that. So, don't look for too much stuff. Also, don't look too far out. I see so many programs promising that, they will impact, graduation rates and things that are more distal. And, I once saw a program here in the state serving elementary school students, who are about, up to age, maybe 10 or 11. And they said that one of the goals of their program was eventually preventing teen pregnancy. And I'm like, really? How are you doing that when you're mentoring like an 8-year-old? Like, are you actually talking about safe sex? Probably not, right? So don't look too far out for outcomes. It goes without saying, or it should go without saying, don't cherry pick your results. So if you do decide to look at a bunch of outcomes, you got to report them, even if the data doesn't look good. I think that's just good, honest practice. And then this is the biggest one here. I think don't cite outcomes for your students or your youth as proof of your program's impact unless you have a counterfactual. And this is where you start to get into what I would call real evaluation, as opposed to something that you could describe more as outcome monitoring. So at the beginning of our year, our mentees, feel this way about their relationships with their parents or whatever. At the end of the year, we see that that's much better. But there could be something else that explains that, just youth growing up and changing developmentally. There might be a new thing at school where the counselor's talking about, getting along better at home with your parents, right? There could be all kinds of things that go into that. And so if you want to claim these changes in young people as your own, you have to have some group of unmentored youth to compare them to. And there are simple and cheap ways to do that. It sounds like you've got an Evaluation 101 webinar coming up soon. I hope they talk about this, because to me, without this, you don't really know what it is you're achieving or not. And then I already said, don't use kind of the homegrown scales and surveys. They may not be valid or reliable. And then just some general tips around this. Know what's happening in your program before you try and evaluate it. So really take a look at that implementation before you start looking at outcomes. I see so many programs that are a year or 2 old that already want to start looking at their impact, and it's just too soon. You're probably ironing out the kinks in what you offer, right? And getting staffed up and figuring it all out. So wait until you're at a moment of kind of program maturity before doing something like that. I think it's important to really figure out, what are the practices that you're doing in your program? Kind of what's the minimum amount of stuff you would need to do to impact a child in the ways you're looking at. I'm a big fan of mixed methods, which basically means blending numbers stuff with feedback with words, right? So I'm a big fan of asking people in your program how it's going, what they'd like to see improved, how mentoring is impacting them. That often tells a much richer story than the data, the numbers ever will, right? And the best evaluations I see combine both of those methods. And then I think, don't overpromise on big issues. And this is something that I think even my own organization is guilty of sometimes. We all want to prove that mentoring is this great thing that has this massive impact, not just on young people, but on our communities, on states and provinces and nations, right? And I believe that to be true in my heart of hearts, but mentors are only part of a larger set of things that need to happen to change the world around us. And so, I'd be cautious about what I promised my program can achieve. I often see in the States here mentoring being applied to issues of community gun violence or economic inequality. But those are issues that have so many roots and things that have been wrestled with in this nation for decades and decades, if not centuries, right? And so it's awfully hard to say that, well, if we just mentor the kids, our town will become less violent, right? There's a lot that goes into that. So think about what is the story you can tell about how you can contribute to that. But think about what makes sense. And you see the quote here at the bottom. This is something that someone said to me at a conference where we were talking about program outcomes, and the fact that their funders always wanted these massive changes for young people in their program. But the guy said, look, we serve young people that have been severely abused, that are in the child welfare system, that are struggling with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, you name it, right? Sometimes just getting these young people to hang on and survive is what success looks like, right? And we have a funder that's wondering why all these children aren't going to Harvard and getting an MBA, right? And it's, so really finding that sweet spot of what does success look like for the young people you serve. I think that's foundationally important. So I want to talk about something I mentioned earlier, which is applying research from other fields. And I think this is a growing trend in mentoring. And I think we can turn to our old internet meme, the galactic brain, here to explain this a little bit. I think when mentoring first got popular again in the early 90s, the mentor was a friend of the child. And then we grew a little bit and said, you know what, maybe this mentor can also be a conduit to other expanded social capital, other opportunities for the young person. Now I think we're at the third stage where the relationship is seen as a context in which other evidence-based practices can be delivered to that young person. So I'm both your friend, but I'm also delivering some other things to you. And then I think the future in the final box here is using mentoring to facilitate societal level change that, in a perfect world would eliminate the need for most mentoring programs. I think that's a goal that I'd like to see us work towards. If any of you have read Tori Weiston's book, Critical Mentoring, in the last year or two since it came out, she talks a lot about this in that book, that it's okay to support individual children with mentoring, but what we haven't been doing is using all of that to change the environment of our cities and our countries at a deep level. So we will get there someday, but that's a conversation for a different webinar. But I do want to give you some examples of what it looks like when we borrow ideas from other fields and bring them into mentoring. So we did a project about 2 years ago at Mentor where we worked with the folks at Stanford University in their PERTS program. And you may have heard of Carol Dweck, who's a researcher there, who developed this concept of growth mindset, which is basically when children believe that no matter where they're at or where they're starting from, that they can improve the way they think, the way they perform in school, what they can learn, the idea that the brain is like a muscle, that if you exercise it, it will get stronger, right? So we borrowed that idea, which is well proven in the education literature, and brought it into mentors and thought, like, what can mentors do to help young people foster a growth mindset? You can find this toolkit online. You could start using it in your program tomorrow, if you'd like, at the mindsetkit.org site. There's also an implementation guide that we've developed that kind of coaches programs on how to weave this into your mentor training. That you'll have to get off the Mentor website, mentoring.org. We're trying to get it uploaded to the PERT site, but just haven't got around to it yet. So we piloted this with a number of programs around the country that were already employing mentors in schools. And here's what we found. We worked with City Year, which is a prominent program here in the States, and found that the mentors who went through that toolkit compared to mentors in their program that did not, really increased their perceptions around how the low-performing students, the lowest performing students they work with, whether they had the ability to turn it around or not. And they changed some beliefs about how they felt about their role as a mentor. But to me, the biggest one is the bolded one there, is that this changed their perception that, I still should work hard for these young people that, I often wonder, is this kid going to make it? Are they ever going to do better in school? This really increased their belief that those low performers can, in fact, turn it around. So it changed how they approach their mentoring. We did a second phase of that and found that when mentors went through this kit, they were more likely to do two key aspects of growth mindset. One was reframing of mistakes as a positive, that, you know, mistakes are actually how we learn. You don't ever learn anything if you get it right the first time. And they also used all the other growth mindset strategies more frequently, things like emphasizing the word yet, right? So instead of a child saying, oh, I'll never be good at math, you know, it's like, well, no, you're not great at math yet, but you will get there. You can improve. And so some real evidence that this changed how these mentors approach their work, and the value that young people, I think, got out of it. Another example, and I got to give credit here to my colleague Sam McQuillan at the University of South Carolina. He runs a mentoring program called AMPed. And you may have heard it described in the literature as the brief instrumental mentoring program, right? It's a mentoring program in schools, only lasts about 8 weeks, I believe. But it uses motivational interviewing techniques to get young people connected to school and to get them kind of engaged and motivated in their own learning. And Sam has translated all of that into a mentoring program context. And I'm not going to unpack this slide too much, but in his program, they measure how much mentors are conforming to kind of the practices of motivational interviewing. So they literally record their conversations with youth and kind of track, are you saying the right things when you're supposed to be saying them? Because to do motivational interviewing well, you have to do it a certain way. And so for any of you in your programs that ask mentors to have very specific conversations or to do things in an intentional way, think about, are we actually measuring them doing that in real life? Or do they get in front of their mentee and start talking about other stuff and wind up shooting hoops for half an hour, right? Not that that's not valuable, but they're not doing the thing that you're kind of counting on them to do. You'll also see that in Sam's program, they track other things that are not about the motivational interviewing. So memorable experiences, fun that they had together, ways in which the program helps these young people develop their leadership skills. So even if you're trying to do something with that much intentionality, don't ever forget that outcomes like fun and happiness are valuable. I mean, I've never seen a funder ask, how many kids in your program are happier than when they started, you know, and that's such a fundamental part of human life, and yet it shocks me that we don't ever seem to value that as a field. So those are other things that you could also look at. So I want to end, and we've got just a few minutes here. Michael, I'll try and whip through this section and leave some time for Q&A. But so say you want to get more into the research on mentoring in other fields, like where do you start? I think, you know, reading all that research can be a pain. I typed the phrase reading research into Google image search, and this was like the third image that popped up. And I was like, yeah, perfect. That captures it perfectly. He looks like somebody that just encountered a peer-reviewed journal article. But luckily, there are other folks that have read through all this stuff and do what I call research translation. So a good place to start with that is that National Mentoring Resource Center. This is a federally funded project that Mentor is lucky enough to be managing on behalf of our Justice Department. But you'll see here, we do all of these reviews of the evidence and what we know about effective programs, what practices matter. You'll find these big reviews of kind of program models. So what do we know about group mentoring? What do we know about cross-age peer mentoring? These are nice 25-page summaries of what we know about these parts of our field. We also do a similar review around specific youth groups. So what do we know about mentoring youth with mental health challenges or those that are reentering community after being incarcerated? So if you're ever looking for broad understandings of parts of our field, I would recommend those. And then for all of these reviews, I write a section at the end called Insights for Practitioners, in which I kind of put on my translation hat and say, okay, we just saw what the evidence says about mentoring, say, you know, LGBTQ youth, right? What does that mean for you running a program? What should you think about doing or incorporating into your work? What's a mistake you should avoid making? So I do even more translation. I translate the translation, so to speak, and really try and make it simple for you all to wrap your heads around what the research is telling us. I also would recommend Gene Rhodes' Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring website. This is a fantastic blog that is constantly posting things about new research. It's how I find out about most research that's coming out, to be perfectly honest. So it's a great resource. And Michael, I'm going to send you guys a handout that you can distribute to the group later around some of these links, right? So don't feel like you got to scribble all this down, those of you that are at home or at work joining us here. David Dubois also runs a listserv for researchers, but there's a lot of program people on it. If you want to join it, you can just email him. And there's other organizations. Many is an organization here in the States that does a lot around mentoring and the intersection of that with other issues like homelessness or mental health challenges. The Handbook of Youth Mentoring is, I think, still an excellent resource. It's a few years old now, but probably the best kind of big book we have on all of this. And then once again, I got to give props to Michael and his team at the Alberta Partnership. You guys, I think, do an excellent job of providing resources, tools, trainings, events like this that build on evidence and share evidence with people in the field. So frankly, you guys do it as good, if not better, than any state level partnership we've got here in the States. So just big kudos to you guys for the effort you put into that. I also learn about a lot of stuff on Twitter. So, following, organizations that do a lot of research around youth or education or related fields. I've got some of them up here on the screen. Even magazines like The Atlantic do pretty good jobs of highlighting new studies that have come out and talking about their real world impact. So, I try and be a sponge about this kind of stuff and really, try and just bookmark things fervently as even if I'm just killing time on Twitter. And I'm going to quickly mention just some strategies for consuming research efficiently. And I think, look, you can often get the gist of whether a study has some meaning for you from just reading the abstract. Is this something that applies to our work? You can also kind of skip forward to the discussion section at the end and see, did whatever they were studying, work in this, if it's a program or evaluation, or if it's a study to see if something mattered in relationships. And, you can kind of cut to the chase a little bit. And if you do find you want to learn more, just mind that references section at the end for more leads around that. And then I'll provide this in a handout. It's a framework that I've actually presented a few times at the National Symposium there in Banff on a few occasions. But it's a framework for thinking about all of this research as a program staff. And I've got a little handout I'll share that basically, and I've seen programs use this as kind of like a monthly book club. So like every month they'll send around a new research article or a report that's come out and ask everyone to read it and kind of wrestle with some of these questions, right? So what is this research about? What was it saying? What did they find? Do we have faith that those findings are good? Or as we read through this, did we think, oh, this doesn't seem right for some reason? And then some questions around, does this apply to our work, right? Is this program even similar to my own? If we did implement some change based on this new research that came out, how would we know it was working? What would it look like in our practice? And do we have the money to make those changes, right? Constantly improving your program is not cheap, right? It takes time and energy and resources to do that. So we'll provide that as a handout here when we're done. But I think it's important to wrestle with these things as a program staff and think about, should we make a change? Now, we just had a thing here in the US where David Dubois in his meta-analysis said, one of the findings was, well, programs where the mentors take on an advocacy or kind of deeper teaching role seem to be more effective in the data, right? Well, that caused everyone in the US to scramble and turn their mentors into advocates, right? Without really understanding what was meant by that and how that would work. How would that change what we're asking our mentors to do? There's a big research study that's about to come out later this year about a bunch of programs that went through that change process. And I'm not going to spoil the ending or the outcomes of it, but it worked for some folks. It really did not work for others. And so I think that was an example of rushing to make a change just because it sounded like a good idea, but perhaps not knowing if it was the right thing to do. So I will stop there, Michael, and see if we've got any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, Michael, for the presentation. If you would like to ask a question of Michael, just indicate in the bottom chat box. Corey's going to post a message just to remind you where it is. So respond to Corey, and he's going to wave at me when we have some questions. But first of all, I wanted to show you, just for an Alberta context, while everyone's typing out their questions, I want to remind you about a document and some research we did called Mentoring at a Glance in 2016 with the University of Alberta Population Research Lab, where we surveyed Albertans about their experiences with mentoring. And I just want to scroll through that document a little bit and show you just kind of what Michael was talking about. A third of Albertans reported mentoring youth in 2016. Now that was both formal and informal. 89% of mentees said mentoring increased their social skills. So definitely talking about self-reported impact. Over half of Alberta adults surveyed were mentored as youth, again, mostly informally. But when you talk about, remember, you had a mentor in your life, wouldn't you like to play it forward and help out a young person in your community? You're already working off an audience that does have positive feelings and remembers a mentor in their life who helped them. So again, 81% of mentees said mentoring helped them stay in schools. 92% said it helped increase their hope for the future. So as you can see, just scrolling through this research in the document, there's some incredible stats there that really will help you make your case for investment to your funders and board and supporters about why an evidence-based mentoring program is important and works just as much in an Alberta context as in an American context that Michael is speaking to. So while we're waiting for a couple of questions, Michael, and I don't mind running over if you have a couple minutes still. Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So the first thing that really stuck with me about was the new research you shared about the cost of mentoring and how more complex programs are more expensive. Obviously, a little more training does cost more. However, to make it through the finish line, it really does make the difference in terms of more training, more match support, more help. So you got to sometimes spend more to get the results that you want. Now, some funders or organizations may be trying to look for a more of a shotgun impact in terms of like a greater number of youth sort of engaged and supported rather than a small surgical slice of youth that are served. So in your experience, how, if an agency is looking to really increase that impact on a few, like a targeted intervention, how do you best make that case in your program design to your funders, to your agency, et cetera?
Well, I think it has to do with the intersection of what young people are bringing to the program in terms of their life experience and their needs, combined with what is the outcome you're shooting for, right? I think where you get into trouble is where you have a program that is explicitly working with young people that are bringing a lot of needs, maybe a lot of strengths too, but have been through some stuff and are going to be, the mentors are going to be helping them wrestle with some real challenges. And then you have these outcome goals that are a little, pie in the sky, so to speak, right? We're being a little too ambitious with what we're trying to move the needle on. I think that's where you start to get into trouble. We did some analysis. I didn't include a slide on it, but we asked programs about the young people that they serve in that same study and found that, and I can't remember every category we asked about, but we asked things like what percentage of your youth were homeless in the last year? What percentage of them are struggling with, doing poorly in school, or perhaps have mental health challenges, or are in the child welfare system? There were a number of categories that we asked about, some positive too. I think we asked about what percentage are, talented and gifted kids in their school, right? And what we found was, as the percentage of young people that had those kind of serious needs, as that percentage went up, the cost spent per young person in those programs went up as well. So if 10% of my young people are involved with gangs, I had a cost per youth served that looked kind of like the national average. If 90% of my young people were involved in gangs, my program was a lot more expensive. And so, folks can find that research on our website. But to me, there is no magic dollar amount. It really is, though, thinking about how intensive does the mentoring need to be? How intensive is the support that we'd have to give those mentors in order for them to be successful? And then, how long is this going to last? Are we really going to walk with these young people, ideally into their young adulthood, or are we trying to do something that's shorter term and more punctuated, right? If you're only focused in your program on one outcome, you might be able to move the needle on that outcome in 4 months, right? If that's all you're doing in your program. But I'm guessing most programs are more holistic than that. They're trying to help young people across many domains of their life. And so to me, that's the best argument to make is just to do that well. Here's the staff resources we need to do that. And if we can't do it well, we run the risk that our program will harm people, right? That's the other counter argument, which is, hey, if you want to do it quick and dirty and on the cheap, there's a chance that some young people will have a mentoring experience that actually harms them. They'll be worse off than if they had never had a mentor at all. So.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder, and it aligns with the research around premature match closure and some of the negative experiences that can align there. Another question we had for you was around, I really like the part you were talking about changing the world from mentoring and how it's an individual intervention, but we need to be very careful that we don't overpromise on the big issues and undoing challenges like the legacy of colonialism or structural violence. Some of these challenges are really difficult. But at the same time, more and more of our young people today we're seeing are politically engaged and are living in this reality. And like many of them, the mentoring field kind of got woke over the last couple years. And I mean, you referenced Tori Winston Sheldon's book, which was just excellent, critical mentoring. But we're seeing this infusion of critical race theory and other, I would say, social justice interventions coming into the mentoring field as well too. So I guess how in examples of programs and communities that are really doing well by this, what are you seeing?
Well, I think one of the things that, and it's, kind of the heart of Tori's book basically, is to really ask yourself, is our mentoring program adult oriented or is it young person oriented? In other words, is the point of your mentoring relationships to get young people to do better in the way Tori describes it, a toxic world, right? We're going to help you thrive in the poisoned pond, so to speak. Or is it to use mentoring to help that young person, empower that young person to figure out what they want to change about their community or their school or whatever it may be? And really, your role as a mentor is to facilitate the direction they want to go and let them define what success from this relationship looks like, define what success in their own life would look like. I think that's a scary place for programs to go, because often the promises we make our funders is that we're going to move the needle on these kind of adult problems, right? I was talking with an affiliate of ours a while back that had been really engaged in some local conversations around gun violence in their community and was making the case that mentoring could be part of that solution, right? And they were emphasizing things like, helping young people make better decisions, helping them regulate their emotions a little bit better. There's a number of things that I think a mentor could do to help a young person feel like that doing that kind of violence towards others is just not part of who they are or what they want to be. But the community in which this conversation was taking place was incredibly impoverished and frankly flooded with guns. And so they recognized that I can do my piece as a mentoring program to help this. But in order for this to get better, we're going to have to really talk about economic mobility and growth in our community. We're going to also have to talk about just restricting access to guns, because trying to do this work when there is 2 guns for every man, woman, and child in the city, that's going to be an uphill battle. And so I think it's really just thinking carefully about what is the role that you can play, and then working with other advocates, other organizations, to really do community level change. I'm familiar with a little bit of the work of the Tamarack Institute up there in Canada that's been doing a lot of work with Canadian cities around economic mobility. And part of that is services for youth and families so that they can be stronger and healthier and better contributors to society. But a lot of it is also like changing the minimum wage and doing tax things and figuring out other ways to balance the scales of what's happening in those communities, and they're allies in that, right? So we have mentoring programs working alongside people that do tax reform or other things, right? So I think it's just a matter of thinking carefully about that, and never really saying that mentoring is going to solve any of it by itself. I think we all know that to be true, but when we're out there kind of hustling for funding, it can be tempting to maybe overpromise a little bit.
Absolutely. And one final question. I thank you again for this presentation, and you referenced the elements of effective practice for mentoring, and we often talk, because we have mentoring programs in Alberta that range from very small, operating out of a public library, all the way up to decades old established community fixture programs. So we often talk about, like you did, from the friendship model to evidence-based practices. We talk about the good to the better spectrum. And now the elements of effective practice are a fantastic checklist to think about many of those pieces. But what would you say to a practitioner who's listened today and they're just overwhelmed by all of the different pieces and they're asking where to begin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is a 4-page checklist version of the elements that is pretty easy to go through. I think a good starting point is to literally just take 10 minutes or 20 minutes and go through that and put a plus or a minus or whatever coding you want to use to just see, like, are we doing this in our program, and do we think we're doing it well? Right? Because you could do at some level all of those practices that we recommend, but if you're doing them poorly, like, it's still not going to matter, right? You can't offer training but have it be a terrible training, right? So that's where I think you have to listen to your constituents. So I would do 2 things. I would figure out ways of getting that feedback from my mentors, my mentees, their parents and guardians, other stakeholders in our program, and really listen to that feedback and figure out where do we need to improve. I would also do that implementation tracking. I am shocked, and I get it. Money is tight. People come and go from your staff. It's hard to have consistency in the delivery of a mentoring program, but I will read these evaluations of programs that have plenty of money and robust staffing and have been around for decades, and you'll read these research studies or an evaluation of the program, and you see these gaping holes in what they theoretically do in their policy manual or procedure manual and what actually happened in real life in terms of training mentors, preparing people for the experience, checking in with them. Michael, you've been to a few of those summer institutes here in Portland over the years. There was one a few years ago where someone got up and said, well, we've had a lot of turnover, and through a whole bunch of other random circumstances, we found ourselves in a situation where we had 3 people monitoring 1,000 matches in our program. And needless to say, they weren't checking in very well with everybody, and I think wound up having an incident where a young person was harmed, and nobody was checking in and nobody caught it, and obviously devastating news for that program. And so I would start with that. At least do what you say you're going to do on paper, and ask the people that are the recipients of it, is this playing out the way you had expected? I think you can do a lot to improve a program by just doing those two things.
No, I think you said it very well, and the elements does have the checklist and then also a more detailed breakdown. And I find speaking to someone from a large or small program, everyone can kind of see themselves within the elements. That there's different ways that it may look different in a certain community, especially with some of our cultural groups where there's strong family ties, rather familial ties. Sometimes checks look different than in other communities. So everybody sort of adapts it to their own way, but the elements I think are a really solid check-in for everyone to consider.
Yeah, and one last point on that, Michael, it was really hard to put together this version of the elements because our field is so diverse. I mean, if you think of that document as kind of the 10 commandments of mentoring or something, it was almost impossible to come up with a set of practices that applied to a program that's just trying to help third graders feel more comfortable at school versus a program that's helping young adults age out of the foster care system and start a life on their own, right? I mean, those are so radically different. I would say keep an eye out for these supplements as we keep coming out with them. There's a lot in that first one, that STEM mentoring guide, that actually almost contradicts some of the practices that we recommend in the main elements. So I appreciate the nuance and diversity of this field. And so there's always room to be growing what counts as a good practice, right? And that's the work that I'm engaged in over the next few years.
Yeah, no, that's excellent, and we're very much looking forward to it. I mean, we've been creating our own supplements up here in Canada for our listening audience. Many of you have heard about our refugee, new immigrant, and Indigenous toolkit. You might have heard about our considerations for mentoring in Indigenous communities as well. We also are working on some other pieces right now to support youth in care and in kinship care and foster care, where we're really working with some great partners around Alberta and across Canada to pull some great pieces together. So we'll be linking to those in the show notes as well too. Michael, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing. We'll definitely check in with you again next year. For those of you who are interested, in the show notes, we're going to link to the resources that Michael spoke about the Chronicle for Evidence-Based Mentoring, about some of the other pieces in his presentation where you can go and sharpen your saw. I know every week I try and listen to the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring's podcast as well too. It's an excellent way to hear about some cutting-edge research from Dr. Rhodes. Finally, we want to thank all of you for participating in our listening audience at home. If you have further questions, you can always reach us at mentor.support@albertamentors.ca. And we remind you just to subscribe to our Mentoring Minute podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. If you have an iPhone, you have a podcast app already built into it. You just tap on it called Podcasts. You search for Alberta Mentors, you'll find us and you can subscribe. And then every time we do a webinar, it's saved right into your phone and you can listen on your commute to work or as you're vacuuming around the house or doing whatever chores. Corey, we also have a YouTube channel that everyone can subscribe to. We'll pull that up. You can look at our YouTube channel if you don't have an iPhone and you want to watch the videos, you can find us on Google Play. You can listen to us on different podcast apps such as Stitcher or Google Play. You can subscribe to our future learnings. And of course, we try and capture these and share them out across remote Alberta as much as possible. So thank you again, Michael. Fantastic presentation. And we'll share your PowerPoint and we hope to see you again in person soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone.